We're going to look at an example of how costs flow from one process to the next. We are still staying with our current company that we start in the cutting department and then move to the assembly department. So we have in the current month $200,000 in manufacturing costs, including direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, were charged to the cutting department. The department cut enough material to manufacture 10,000 units of production, and those cut materials were transferred to the assembly department. So when we transfer, we're going to credit the work in process cutting department and add them to the work in process assembly department. When we use process costing, we look at equivalent units of production. So our equivalent units is a concept which expresses the number of partially completed units as a smaller number of fully completed units. For example, 2 1/2 full pitchers are equivalent to 1 full pitcher. So at the end of each period, when we're applying costs, we look for the equivalent units of production, and we use what's called percentage of completion when we're calculating those equivalent units. In this example, we have a pencil company. They started 15,000 units and completed 10,000 units. The 5,000 units in process are 30% complete at the end of the period. How many equivalent units of production did Pencil Company have for the period? So we take our 10,000 completed units and then we add 5,000 work in process units at 30% complete to get our equivalent units of 11,500. We use that number of units to apply costs for the period. Our cost per equivalent unit is the total product cost for the period, so all direct labor, direct materials, and overhead accumulated during the period, divided by our equivalent units for the period. So we go back to this pencil company. We incurred $27,600 in production cost. So what was our cost per unit for the period? We had 11,500 equivalent units. So we take $27,600 divided by 11,500, and we end up with a cost of $2.40 per equivalent unit. Now we're going to look at the assembly department. So the assembly department has 3 steps in their production process. In step 1, they add the cut materials from the materials that they received from the cutting department. Step 1 is 30% of the assembly process. So if we end the period when items are in step 1, they will be 30% complete. In step 2, we add other direct materials, and once we've finished step 2, that's another 50% of the assembly process. So if we have items that are at the end of step 2 at the end of the period, we would have 80% completion, 30% plus 50%. And when they're ready to be sent to the packing department, we are 100% complete in the assembly process. Now we're going to look at the assembly department. So we have a lot of information here about the assembly department. We have our beginning work in process costs on March 1st. The materials, those $200,000 in materials, we were transferred from the cutting department. And then the materials we add during assembly and the direct labor and overhead costs that we use in the assembly department during the month of March. Now we look at, on March 1st, we had 1,000 units in process. Those units were 30% complete. So step 1 was finished on them, but they had not been through step 2 or 3. During March, 10,000 units of cut materials were transferred from the cutting department to the assembly floor. And then on March 31st, there were 3,000 units in process. These units were 80% complete with respect to their conversion, so they had not been through step 3. So we have our beginning inventory was 1,000. The units we started in process were the 10,000 units transferred from the cutting department. So our total units in process for the month of March are 11,000 units. At the end of the month, we have 3,000 units left in our ending inventory that are not complete. The finished units that are finished in assembly get transferred to the packaging department. So 11,000 minus 3,000 is 8,000 that we transferred. We subtract our beginning inventory that was partially completed, and we get our units started and completed in March of 7,000. So now when we're trying to figure out what the equivalent units that we have for March, when we transfer materials in, when we add materials to them, and then our conversion, which is our direct labor and overhead. So we have 7,000 units that we started and completed during the month. We had 1,000 units already in process. So if we look at the cut materials transferred in, those 1,000 units were already through step 1. So they were 0% for the cut materials transferred in. We have 0 equivalent units because they were already through that step. However, they still needed step 2, which was the trim materials, and part of step 3. Remember, they were 30% complete. So we take 1,000 times 30% and we subtract that from the conversion. We only had 700 left to complete in our equivalent units because only 70% of the work needed to be finished. The same thing happens then with our work in process inventory. So we have these 3,000 units that were not complete at the end of the month, but they had been through step 1 and 2. They were 80% complete for conversion. So 3,000 times 80% gives us 2,400. So for our transferred in materials, we had 10,000 equivalent units. For the trim materials, when we add during step 2, we have 11,000 equivalent units. And for conversion costs, which are direct labor and overhead, we have 10,100 equivalent units. Then we look at our costs. We have the cost of our beginning work in process, the materials that were transferred in, the materials that we added during the month, the direct labor we incurred during the month, and the overhead incurred. So we have our cost per equivalent unit for cut materials was the 200,000 transferred in from the cutting department and the 10,000 equivalent units, giving us $20 cost per unit for cut materials. We added 44,000 in trim materials and we had 11,000 equivalent units for trim. Our conversion costs, remember, our direct labor and overhead, divided by our 10,100 equivalent units for conversion equals $25. Now we see the details of our work in process inventory for March. So we started with 1,000 units. We added direct labor. We transferred in direct materials from the cutting department. We added more direct materials during the assembly. We have overhead costs, giving us total cost to account for $526,000. Then our cost transferred to packaging apply to 8,000 units. We added trim to 1,000 units that were work in process. We had our work in process beginning balance and then our conversion for the work in process units. Additionally, we started and completed, in addition to completing the 1,000 units that were in process, we started and completed an additional 7,000 units that received full cost of that period. In our ending balance, we have equivalent units of 3,000 for materials and 2,400 of conversion. That is because in the conversion or production process, we have 80% complete. So we take the 3,000, we're 100% complete for materials, which is why it's 3,000, and we're 80% complete for conversion. So we take 3,000 times 80%, giving us that 2,400 equivalent units. We transfer 8,000 units to packaging, along with the cost of $394,000. So the journal entry to transfer from assembly to packaging is here.